Welcome back, everybody, to our lecture today, The Peculiar Institution. Slavery in Antebellum America. So this continues our discussion now of history in the period that historians call the Antebellum era. It's a Latin expression. It means before the war. And of course the war in this instance is the Great Civil War of the mid-19th century. So the antebellum period is the 30 years or so that preceded the Civil War, roughly from 1830 to 1860. Looking at American slavery in the antebellum period, sometimes Southern politicians of that era would refer to slavery as, quote, peculiar institution. But in fact, slavery was not peculiar to the United States South. Instead, it was an institution that had ancient roots and existed throughout the Atlantic world from the beginnings of colonial settlement. Slavery in the Americas had been fueled by one of the greatest human migrations in history, as you'll recall, and from 1500 to 1840, Africans outnumbered Europeans almost 3 to 1 as New World arrivals. And you can see from the map here that along the length of the so-called slave coast of West Africa to points across the Atlantic Ocean in the Western Hemisphere, from the English colonies of North America to the islands of the West Indies, to Mexico and Central America, and to the vast expanse of South America and the Spanish mainland colonies of South America. We see the Atlantic slave migration delivering ultimately 12 million, approximately 12 million African people into the Western Hemisphere. Africans lived throughout the Americas. Pie chart showing where in the Americas the great streams of migration tended. Notice here that the British mainland of North America, where the 13 colonies were, represents a relatively small fraction of the total importation compared to the Spanish slave trafficking into the colonies of New Spain, but even some of the West Indian sugar colonies, the Dutch, Caribbean, the sugar colony of Barbados, first Spanish and later English, by comparison receive a greater proportion of the slave traffic for the fact that their colonial cash crop economies kept up a nearly insatiable demand for labor. You see a depiction of an Atlantic ship delivering, among other things, a coffle of slaves. And it was the labor of slaves that would transform a hemisphere. Listen to writer Charles Mann in his book 1493. This great transformation, a turning point in the story of our species, was wrought largely by African hands. The crowds thronging the streets in the new cities were mainly African crowds. The farmers growing rice and wheat in the new farms were mainly African farmers. The people rowing boats on rivers, then the most important highways, were mainly African people. The men and women on the ships and in the battles and around the mills were mainly African men and women. Slavery, says Mann, was the foundational institution of the modern Americas. An extraordinary fact, but one that is well documented by historians. Even in the United States, slavery was not exclusively the South's peculiar institution. As this map shows, every one of the northern states, originally that is the northern colonies from New England to Delaware, and then into the period of nationhood, the northwestern territory of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, etc., all the way out to the Mississippi River, that each of these northern states either had slavery in its history or took specific action to abolish slavery. Slavery had been abolished in Canada in the 1790s, for example. So slavery once marked the entire territory, and only through process of emancipation did it gradually become the South's peculiar institution. So that although the emancipation of slaves and subsequent prohibition of slavery had been more common in the North after the Revolution, largely because the northern colonies, that is, northern states now, did not typically rely upon plantation agriculture as a main source of revenue. Nevertheless, slavery still existed in pockets of the North well into the age of Jackson, and that's shown on the map here by the emancipation dates. So, for example, in New York, slavery was generally abolished, but continued through provisions in the law to exist into the 1820s. Over 400 slaves resided in Pennsylvania in 1830, while 2,200 did so in New Jersey. And as I say, an estimated 10,000 slaves still lived in New York as late as 1820. And enslaved people in America were put to labor in a variety of occupations in a variety of settings. About 10% worked in commerce, trades, and industry, principally in towns and cities. Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia, for example, was one of the biggest factories in the country. Tredegar and other factories bought and sometimes hired many slaves. Hired slaves often worked under contract for a fixed period of time by agreement with the slave owner. In a similar way, enslaved women might hire out as maids, launderers, and cooks to white families by agreement with their owners. So an economically flexible institution, you might say, but the common denominator for all slaves, no matter what their actual employment status, was the fact that they were denied their freedom. They did not own their labor, nor the products that their labor inspired. They were themselves, instead, human property. And yet by the 1800s, the rise of King Cotton in the South became the dominant economic engine driving slavery. You see here the mix of cash crops that defined the Southern economy, with cotton representing the dominant portion of that economy. The rapid expansion of cotton after 1800 with the advent of the cotton gin revived slavery. The slave population of the United States increased from about 698,000 to nearly 4 million between 1790 and 1860. And 75% of these enslaved people worked as agricultural laborers, growing cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco, and hemp. The majority of these worked on cotton plantations as field hands, though about 15% of Southern slaves were classified as domestic servants. So great was the demand for enslaved labor that a highly profitable domestic slave trade arose to supply the demand. Congress had abolished the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, but far from cutting into the supply of new slaves, that act merely gave way to a much more higher concentration of slave trading in what was known as the domestic slave trade, that is, slaves born here in the United States who were subsequently traded and sold downriver, as they said, constituting the domestic slave trade, which began in the 1760s and flourished after 1800 with the growth of the Cotton Kingdom. Fed by natural increase, more than 1.2 million enslaved men, women, and children, a majority of them American-born, were bought, sold, traded, and forced to move. An entire infrastructure, you might say, of domestic slave trading arose in the age of the market revolution to handle the commerce of human beings, just as other economies developed to handle the exchange of other trade items. further defining the meaning of the market in the age of the market revolution. Originating in the older South states of Carolina, Kentucky, and Virginia, the great majority of slaves trekked south into cotton districts, chained in coffles, what were called coffles, here described by Sella Martin, a former slave. A long row of men chained two and two together, called a coffle, and numbering about 30 persons, was the first to march forth from the pen. Then came the quiet slaves, that is, those who were tame in spirit and degraded. Then came the unmarried women, or those without children. After those came the children, who were able to walk, and following them came mothers with their infants and young children in their arms. So an extraordinary description here of the procession of a slave coffle, with its various gradations of slaves by gender, by parentage, by childhood, even infancy. All part of the march of commerce. Families torn apart by the auction block reminded everyone that slavery did not acknowledge even the most basic rights as belonging to slaves, as is testified by Charles Crawley, an ex-slave, who recalled that, quote, slaves were auctioned off the highest bidder. Lord, Lord, I done seen them young'uns fought and kick like crazy folks. Child, it was pitiful to see them. They didn't know nothing about their kinfolks, recalled Elijah Davison. Most chillun didn't know who they pappy was, and some they mammy, when she weaned them, or sell or trade the children to someone else so they wouldn't get attached to their mammy or pappy. A complete estrangement, a natal alienation, as one historian calls it, to be torn from one's birthright, torn from one's parentage, to be traded or sold as a commodity from the auction block. A balance of power and profit shaped the slave owners' treatment of their human property. Slave cabins, for example, were usually one-room structures with dirt floors and a chimney at one end. The cabin was perhaps 16 by 18 feet and housed 5 or 6 people. Sometimes a loft was used as a sleeping room for children. Slave cabins generally were grouped together on a street with several cabins facing each other across a lane, what was called the slave quarters. Clothing was also basic. The proper and usual quantity of clothes for plantation hands is 2 suits of cotton for spring and summer and 2 suits of woolen for winter, 4 pair of shoes and 3 hats. At least that's how a Georgia planter described it in the 1850s. What historians know, of course, is that the clothing that was made for slaves not only helped inspire a textile industry up north, that is, in the mills and factories of New England, that is a special market for slave clothing, but that it was also quite common to see slaves who had worn through their clothes or otherwise found themselves without, going naked or half naked or semi-naked, especially for children, right on through the seasons. Due to Christian modesty, many slave owners would, of course, took care to cover up female slaves in particular, despite what I'm about to tell you with regard to their sexual exploitation. It was the Victorian modesty that required women to be covered. But the supply of clothes was uncertain and varied from season to season. As I say, it was an uncertain prospect, just exactly what one might expect in regard to clothing. Slave cabin, here you see a Keithfield plantation in Georgetown County, South Carolina, represents what might be a fair example of a slave quarter, though we shouldn't take it too literally. Slave cabins could be little more than lean-tos, really, or single-room, thatched roof, perhaps framed by cut timber, perhaps by log, a whole variety, really, of ramshackle to fairly solid. It represents the architecture of the slave cabin. Historians debate whether slaves were fed an adequate diet, for example, but slaves had to be resourceful in finding ways to feed themselves regardless. There certainly was an incentive on the part of the slave owner to keep his slaves fed well enough to work. Even though the standard slave fare of corn and pork may have been adequate in terms of calories, though, lack of proper sanitation led many slaves to suffer high rates of dysentery and cholera. Some historians point to high infant mortality rates, and low birth weights as evidence of inadequate nutrition in slave mothers. Though in basic ways, enslaved peoples influenced the birth of an Atlantic world cuisine. At the amusement park known as Dollywood in Tennessee here, a living history recreation of the traditional one-pot African stew. From West Africa to Southern cooking, traditions of cuisine and food preparation influenced the culture of the slave societies. From the one-pot stews to the cooking of seasoned beef over an open flame to African words like bananas, gumbo, and jambalaya. African cuisine was reborn in the slave societies of the South. So yeah, what we call Southern cooking today is essentially an African improvisation, that is, of West African slaves who brought their culinary traditions with them and improvised as best they could New World variants, creating regional cuisines like Southern cooking. And our words, bananas, gumbo, jambalaya, themselves African words, remind us of this connection. There's no getting around the fact that violence is one of the American slavery's most haunting legacies. Slavery ultimately was a system of coercion and control. Slaves represented profits, of course, which meant damaging slaves an expensive practice, but it did not stop the use of corporal punishments, physical abuse, to inspire discipline, to enforce discipline, or merely at the behest of a sadistic overseer. When picking cotton, I never put more than 20 stripes, and very frequently not more than 10 or 15, recalled one plantation owner, who even specified the number of stripes, as he called them, that is, the whipping of slaves with a leather belt or improvised device. Nevertheless, slave owners employed violence to exert their control and maintain production. He was a very mean man in all his ways and was very much disliked by the slaves. He used to whip them, often in a shameful manner. On one occasion I saw him take a slave whose name was Pinckney and make him take off his shirt. He then tied his hands and gave him 100 lashes on his bare back, and all this was because he lacked 3 pounds of his task, which was valued at 6 cents. So recalled Richmond slave William Box Brown, describing the plantation overseer on his plantation. Enslaved women, of course, were equally defenseless. There was no chivalry, no allowances made for gender. A famous illustration called Virginian Luxuries, a painting from the period, satirically connected slave owners' sexual exploitation of enslaved women with the beating of their male and female slaves, as if a luxury to be afforded the white slave owner. Despite what she described as a good relationship with her master, who was a church minister, an ex-slave woman, Elizabeth, later wrote in her autobiography that her owner whipped her to subdue what he called her stubborn pride. Enslaved men, unable to defend their wives, often preferred to marry women from other plantations. No colored man wishes to live at the house where his wife lives, for he has to endure the continual misery of seeing her flogged and abused without daring to say a word in her defense, as recalled Moses Grandy, a former slave. If my wife must be exposed to the insults and licentious passions of wicked slave driver and overseers, heaven forbid that I should be compelled to witness the sight, said Henry Bibb, himself a former slave. So yes, it's part of the Gone with the Wind mythology of America that there were kindly slave owners, paternal slave owners, men who treated slaves as extensions of their own family, as children, surrogate children as it were. But really, when examined more carefully, that mythology is laid bare. Slavery was, at bottom, a system of restriction, a system of restraint, physical, psychological punishments and restraints. It was a coerced system, not a voluntary system. And under such circumstances, slave owners who prided themselves on being paternal, that is, the stereotypical nice slave owner, were really just erecting a kind of screen of illusion. For I wonder who among us would even dare to trade places with a slave in antebellum America, no matter how kindly the master. The fundamental denial of freedom rendered one entirely vulnerable. And so it doesn't make sense to spend much effort in defining kind slave owners or caring slave owners, because slavery itself was essentially an inhumane institution. Enslaved women, of course, framed by white perspectives ever since. The Gone with the Wind image of the mammy myth. She was maternal, non-sexual, important for a woman in the master's home, pious, devoted to white children. Therein lie the mammy myth. Given famous expression, of course, in the motion picture Gone with the Wind. There you see actress Hattie McDaniel playing Mammy next to Scarlett O'Hara, the character Scarlett O'Hara, played by the actress Vivian Leigh. The Hayward family's slave Louisa, pictured in an 1858 portrait, holding the child of the family who was legally her owner. What sorts of relationships between men and women, between slave and free on the plantations developed? Well, all manner of relationships, but don't forget, relationships that were always defined by the bottom line of freedom and unfreedom, ownership and enslavement, coercion and punishment. Children were born into enslavement, of course. Enslaved children put to work doing basic chores, such as cleaning up the yard around the owner's home, taking water to the adults in the fields, weeding in the cotton rows, and carrying corn to the mill. As ex-slave Charles Crawley remembered, being only a boy, worked around his children, doing this and that, little things the white folks call me to do. No childhood to speak of. Every southern state passed laws that forbid teaching a slave how to read. And yet enslaved men and women sometimes managed to learn the basics despite the laws. As Candace Goodwin, a former slave, recalled, "And the white children, they learned me how to read too. Of course, the white folks didn't want you to learn. I remember just as clear as yesterday now, one of them children learned me how to read compressibility. Thought I was something then. I can read Bible little now, but I can't write, never learned to write." A photograph from the Reconstruction era here showing formerly enslaved children learning how to read at a Freedmen's Bureau school just after the Civil War. It was one of the greatest interests that the former slaves had upon the ending of the war and the abolishment of slavery was the ability to attain the rudiments of education, of reading and writing. Why did the southern slave states prohibit slavery or prohibit slaves from learning to read? I think the answer is fairly obvious. Reading was empowerment. Reading was information. It was more difficult to keep down a people who were informed, who were educated, enlightened. The greatest slave rebellion in American history, the Nat Turner Rebellion, was inspired by a slave, Nat Turner, who could read, who communicated passages from the Bible and perhaps abolitionist newspapers to his fellow slaves. I like to tell my students to keep that in mind when they feel tempted to complain about having to read assignments in class. None of the freedmen complained. They understood reading was power, and the difference between being a slave and being a free person consisted in, among other things, that ability to read. And in the case of Frederick Douglass, the famous case of Frederick Douglass, a liberated voice that became a powerful weapon on behalf of human rights, Douglass, born into slavery and raised in the institution, eventually received his freedom in the most direct way possible. He ran away from his plantation, found freedom in the North, and education and sponsorship among the abolitionists of the North, until eventually emancipated again as a man of voice, as a newspaper editor, as an orator, as a leader of civil rights for people of color. Douglass said that for the present it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race. His famous oration, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" spoken before a mostly white audience in the North in the years before the Civil War. What to the slave is the 4th of July, was a clarion call by Douglass for the country to endow the slave, to emancipate the slave, and to endow him with equal rights. Is a call that would ring out through the years. And a reminder that the mythology of slavery, the Gone with the Wind picture of slavery, is better left to the movies, better left to the pleasant fantasies for the apologists of slavery. Has really no place in reality, no place in actual history. Slavery was a degrading, inhumane, terrifying institution. One that has defined the relations of Americans, black and white, ever since. We are still working our way as a nation out of slavery. So we'll have more to say about the conflicts involving slavery as we continue through this unit now of the Antebellum era. Of course, the road to civil war will take us through the many conflicts over slavery. But this is an American story, a story at the center of the narrative of the nation we were and the nation we are. Okay, everyone, that's good for now. We'll see you in the next lecture.